My missing cat for 11 years came back, but I can't believe what those men did to it. In 2012 my family and I relocated to Oklahoma with our, almost 5-year-old, cat Shadow. He got out of the house and never came back. I spent 2 years looking for him, holding out hope for the call he'd been found. He's chipped, but nothing. At 3 years that I made peace thinking he had died and he was mourned, and to this day we still talk about how much he is loved and how much he's been missed. Last year we relocated to my hometown and last month we experienced a devastating tornado. My house is fine, but we only get paid once a month on the first, so having to replace all the $500 plus groceries we had already purchased for the month, as well as things we'd need to make the house comfortable for daily life, left our finances less than ideal with no room to wiggle. Then I get a call from a veterinarian office and my sweet boy has been found. He had been living on a residential street for the last 6 years and was being fed by the neighborhood. No vet's visits, no comfy bed, no shelter from the heat and cold except sporadically when they took pity on him. He had been attacked by something and required minor care and stitches, which is when they found his chip with my information. I was so happy and couldn't wait to see him again, but because we only get paid once a month, I couldn't get there until August 1st. The woman who took him to the vet was on board, but last week started talking about how she didn't know what to do with him while recovers, so she and I scrambled to find funds to make the trip to get him. One bill was less than expected and my parents also agreed to take money from their emergency fund to make up the rest so I can go get him. Now I'm being told that he's been given to another couple in the neighborhood who just love him so much and they're going to keep him in nothing but radio silence since then. I have no idea where they live, other than the town, so now my children and I have to mourn him all over again. I'm so devastated and I'm losing him all over again. Financially we'll recover in no less than 2 months, but emotionally this is a blow that will stay with me forever. We love you, Shadow, and miss you with all our hearts, and I'm so sorry we won't be able to see you. I went on vacation with my bestie and realized she's the dumbest person I've ever met. I'm a guy and have a female best friend. We've been friends for quite a while, never dated, and I have a girlfriend. We are both in college and I don't know how she is even in college after spending a week with her. Like, I literally don't know how she's gotten this far in life, and no clue how she's going to get a career job. To point out some things, she was telling me about how she is starting to get depression and anxiety. I then asked her to look at her screen time and the girl is spending 7.5 hours a day on social media. That's almost as much time as a full-time job, and she doesn't see how that's damaging her mental health. We were getting ready to leave the house and took a bunch of food out of the fridge to put it in a cooler. She said we absolutely cannot take any ice out of the freezer. I looked at her with a confused look on my face and asked why. She said she didn't want to use up all the ice. I then had to explain to her how the freezer makes ice. We had some beers left over in the fridge. I asked her if she wanted to split the beers between us. She had no clue what I meant, so I had to explain to her that she would take half of the beers and I would take the other half. She drove through some mud that was on the road from some contractors in the neighborhood and then parked on the driveway. It rained the next day, mud from the car got on the driveway, no big deal. She went to hose it off and then asked for my help. She said it wasn't coming off, and I had to tell her that it's not like a pressure washer where it will remove the dirt in a few seconds, and that she just has to hold it there for a while and eventually all the dirt will come off the driveway. I checked the oil in her car since she drove 8 hours to this place and it wasn't reading on the dipstick. I told her she needed to add a bit of oil, but she said she didn't need any because it's not due for an oil change yet. I had to explain to her that older cars will burn oil, and she's at risk of blowing her engine with it being this low on oil. She took a hot baking sheet out of the oven and asked where to put it. I said on the stove. It's meant to withstand very hot things. She said, but it's a gas stove and the stove isn't on, will it damage it? As we were cleaning up, there was an empty beer box. She asks me, do you want this box? Me, what the fuck do I want an empty beer box for? I will still probably be friends with her, but I don't think I will ever be able to go on another trip with her again. I literally lost brain cells from spending a week with her. She is oblivious to every single thing and what I call clinically dumb. She wants to be a police officer, but I do not see that happening. I once had her shoot my 9mm handgun, and once it went off she started screaming and waving the gun in every direction with her finger still on the trigger and fully loaded. The girl needs so much growing up to do. I don't know if she will ever get super far in life, sadly. I'd love to help and I challenge her to think critically, but she refuses to make any lifestyle changes that will benefit her, such as reading, cutting back on screen time, cutting back on going to bars with her sorority friends, going on some walks in the park, etc. She is the most stereotypical dumb sorority blonde you see in movies. I never thought there was anyone that dumb in real life, but she has proven me wrong. My entire marriage was a part of an elaborate scheme and I was the only person that didn't know. My entire marriage was a part of an elaborate scheme and I was the only person that didn't know. My husband's best friend just broke up with his girlfriend, and while he was out drinking to cheer his best friend off, the ex info dumped me, and I don't know how to process this at all. When I first met my husband in college, I was dating another guy, Tom. Tom was a transplant to the area and had study buddies but few friends, so when he became really good friends with these guys he met at the college bar, I was happy for him. But as Tom grew closer to his new friends, he grew more and more distant from me. Around this time was when I met my future husband at a party that Tom's new friends threw, and we bonded over how my husband was taking the same elective classes as me in the coming semester. We agreed to be study buddies, which Tom was cool with. He was ever the jealous type, but as the new semester rolled on, Tom started to get paranoid about my relationship with my husband and got abusive. Every time Tom got verbal abusive and even laid hands on me, my husband was my support and telling me I deserve better, to leave Tom. My husband even supported me when I aborted Tom's baby after I finally decided to leave him. I just heard from my husband's best friend's ex that apparently this was all set up by my husband and his friends. My husband was love at first sight when he saw me one time on campus and got his friends to befriend Tom. They found out what subjects I was going to do, and my husband enrolled in them. I had that it makes all sense. How my husband just happened to be a fan of my favorite authors, how his favorite places to go to relax was all the houses I liked. His friends would tell Tom that I was 100% cheating and how he should leave me, and call him with updates about when I hanged out with my husband. My husband and his friends created my abuse, the engineered the worst and lowest time in my life, all because my husband wanted to marry him. I'm not rich, I am not a model, I look like any woman on the street, you could find 10 of me on any busy street. A part of me wants to believe that this is all bullshit, she's just mad and trying to break up my marriage, but at the same time, it all fits. How Tom changed, how my husband knew so much about all the things I loved like he was made for me. What if this is real, my husband who comforted me through my abortion, abuse, that I'm so happy with right now was the cause of everything. How do I live now? I want to throw up and die, I don't know how I'm going to live through this. What if I ask him and it's true, who was the most interesting person you've ever been seated next to on an airplane? I was once flying from New York to Frankfurt. 5 minutes before landing, the plane started shaking uncontrollably. There was a violent storm outside, heavy rain, thunderstorms, and fog. I closed the window shades and waited patiently for landing. Now I am someone who hates flying, I would avoid it whenever possible, but given that I travel a few times a year for work, I don't have a way out of it. The best moment throughout the flight is right before landing when I feel a sense of relief and peace. So the plane is about to land and I start collecting my belongings from under my seat. The plane was literally a few centimeters from the ground. Suddenly, the plane takes off again and starts roaming in the sky. There was utter silence. It was a weird feeling, but none of us knew what was happening. A few minutes later, I started panicking. The man next to me sensed my panic and started chatting with me. He was so calm, so collected, so warm that I immediately started feeling better. He told me that he flies frequently and this kind of scenario happens all the time. I believed him at the time. He then asked me why I was traveling. I told him that I was heading back from an academic conference in New York as I am a PhD student. He then said that he was a professor at Stanford. I immediately smiled and mentioned how I've been wanting to visit Stanford for so long but never got the chance. Something amazing happened then. While he was handing me his business card to contact him, the plane finally landed safely. We were actually up in the air for 45 minutes. Time flew because of this kind man. I know today that he wanted to make me feel better and he went out of his way to sound positive and soothing. The pilot announced that the plane was having technical issues, wasn't able to land, and the crew had to call an emergency for assistance. So it was pretty serious. Fast forward 4 years. Later, I end up visiting Stanford as a scholar. I had coffee with this wonderful man and he admitted that he too was freaking out. But by focusing on remaining positive with the mission of calming me down, he was immediately able to overcome his fear. Positivity does wonders. As a police officer, what's the one call that will be with you forever? I was sent to a neighbor dispute probably first couple of weeks after graduating from academy. When I got there I was out of car first and the driver was parking the car. A male had a machete and had his neighbor who was unarmed trapped against a fence. The trapped male's family were nearby pleading for the trapped man's life. He was yelling he was going to take the neighbor's head off. I had my 1-inch barrel snub-nosed police .38 special aimed at his head as soon as I exited the car and was yelling him to drop the machete repeatedly as I approached to a distance of several meters, which was really dangerous to myself. He took a swing and narrowly missed the victim's head. I was severely holding back and should have shot, but one reason I did not shoot was there was a child pulling him backwards yelling, "Dad, don't do it, they'll shoot you." He dropped the machete after a wait-a-long standoff. I arrested him for assault with a deadly weapon. The incident started cause the neighbor had cut his grass. Yes, that was the summary of why he wanted to take his neighbor's head off with a machete in front of his family. Months later I went to a domestic at the same house, same bloke, cause he had lost it. He shot his son in face and executed him. Yes, the same son that saved him from being shot by me. Then he shot self in the eye with the same .22. The rest of family fled the house and were hiding at a neighbor's. We got there after paramedics had just got off him and declared both dead at the scene. I went over and checked both. The child was dead but father had faint pulse. Paramedics jumped in and did rescue CPR. My partner, a sergeant from earlier incident, leaned over and punched me and I bounced off the wall. The paramedics were shocked by what they had seen. I was assisting ambulance en route to hospital, taking turns doing CPR when I related the earlier incident. In the ambulance everyone was quiet. Till we got to hospital. The senior paramedic then replied, "Sorry John, you stuffed up, should have put a pillow over his face." The male survived the bullet which had entered his eye, then ran around inside cranium and ring barked his brain. He was going to be a lifelong assisted care patient. One justified shot could have saved everyone, especially his son and his family, a lot of grief and suffering. It was not the only time I was justified in shooting an armed attacker whom I arrested without shooting. He used minimum force. And that attacker later killed some innocent person in a gruesome and horrific way which was preventable. To make things even more offensive, I was recommended a bravery award for disarming him, which I refused in the most offensive manner, disgusted at the results of my own conduct. When did you realize your parents were bad at parenting? I think I was 6 years old. I had been playing with my younger cousin next door. Went back to my house for dinner. I was already sleeping by the time my mother got home at around 10 p.m. She suddenly yanks me out of bed and started beating me with my older sister's horsewhip. My sister used to go to a horseback riding school called De Rosa and her whip was made of very thick rubber with a leather tip. My mother first struck me at the neck, then my chest, then it was a flurry of whips all over. I remember cringing and scurrying over to the farthest corner of my small room to get away from her. She followed me, hitting my legs and arms. I imagine I was balled up in a fetal position because she hit my butt and back. My aunt had come into the house to check why I was screaming. She pulled my mother back away from me, restrained her and carried me out of my room and into her car to bring me to the hospital. I was unconscious for 2 days at the intensive care unit. She had broken one of my ribs when she kicked me and knocked me out when she punched my head and broke my nose. She had beaten me black and blue all over. It turned out that the maid from my aunt's house thought that I had taken the money that was supposed to be paid for their water bill, and she told my mother about it as soon as she got home. She didn't know that my uncle had taken the money that afternoon to pay it himself. I stayed at the ICU for 5 days and a total of 2 weeks in the hospital. To this day my mother has never once apologized for what she did to me. Teachers, have you ever found students trying to hide that they're smart? I grew up in the public school gifted system created in the early 80s in TX. It was one better meant for high achievers, not truly gifted children as we know them today. In fact, the more gifted you are, the harder it became to succeed in the system because you would get more work, often extra work given to you on top of what was expected. One learned to pretend to be dumb or be an underachiever very young. I remember being asked to tutor my classmates or kids in younger grades as early as 2nd grade. I was also asked to do things like copy ditto sheets, which were masters that were made into early mimeograph copies, late 70s. They did this to keep me busy since I would finish my work far too quickly and had nothing for me to do otherwise, back in 1-3 RD grade. Other kids started picking on me at that point, teacher's pet. Later, work began to get harder, so they would give me extra problems to do when I would finish faster than the others, or ask me to help the slow kids. Another punishment. I think the one time I enjoyed myself was when GT became a music-based program and we got to listen to orchestral bits and ID the who and what. We learned things about it and the instruments. This was about 3rd grade. Pull-out started the next year and logic puzzles and little projects began then. It was still about once a week however, and most of the time was spent in a normal classroom, bored. My daughter is now dealing with similar issues, and it is my opinion that gifted education really needs to be classified as special education. These kids face so many hurdles socially and emotionally. Thinking that their brains will get them over it simple because they can do the academics is insane. It has nothing to do with psychology. Their brains aren't mature enough to handle the complexity of being the kind of outcast for their entire lives. Many fail simple because of the pressure to fit in with their peers at these tender ages instead of growing up to solve our world's problems with the resources we can provide them. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to confront a thief? What happened? The first time this happened to me was about 15 years ago, and it happened again about 3 years ago. It was fairly late at night and I was still up watching TV. I heard some noises from my patio that couldn't have been the usual animal noises. I turned the TV and the lamp beside me off, reached into the drawer of the end table and got my weapon. As soon as I did this, my dog, Buster, immediately jumped down and moved to the back door. Peeking through the curtain, I quickly spotted an uninvited guest moving around on the patio. I couldn't discern if the person was armed or not, so, in a moment of using my common sense, I eased the door open just a couple of inches. Buster was already very aware that someone was outside and was starting to whine and attempt to go outside. As is his usual reaction to strangers in his territory, he pushed the door open and rushed out. To put it mildly, the next 30 to 45 seconds were pure bedlam. Buster yipped once and then all I could hear was screeching, growls, and crashes as the intruder was tripping over everything on the patio trying to escape. He finally found an exit and ran like hell to the woods in my backyard with Buster in close pursuit. Entering the meager protection of the woods, the intruder made his way to the 6-foot chain-link fence surrounding my property, and that was where Buster's last contact was. Mind you, all this took place in a span of just 4 to 5 minutes, but it was long enough and noisy enough to rouse my neighbors on my left and right to come out to check things out. Honestly, I have never heard such terrified screeching and screaming that would be intruder made. After discussing things with my neighbors, I decided to call the police, and after they arrived, we walked through the route the intruder took in his escape from the dog from hell and found where he'd went over my fence. A fairly large spread of blood spatters and torn clothing were all over the place. Police later picked him up after the hospital contacted them. One of the good things that resulted from this encounter provided was, through word of mouth, everyone that was prone to shop at the midnight swap shop avoided my house. Oh yeah, I failed to mention that Buster is a 90-pound boxer pit mix, has proven to be the most protective and territorial dog I have ever had in my life. What is the most freaky experience you've had with a neighbor? Many years ago, shortly after my divorce, I lived in a cheap apartment complex. I had a neighbor a few doors down named Sarah. We'd usually bump into each other in the parking lot when she was out for a jog. She was very attractive, so I tried to chat her up any chance I got, but she never showed any interest more than just being friendly. It really drove me nuts seeing her out in short shorts and a sports bra nearly every day. Whenever it was nice out, I'd sit outside on my patio whenever I was home since I love being outside. Many nights I'd fall asleep out there after a few glasses of wine. One Friday night I had dozed off, only to be awakened by the sound giggling. I looked into the parking lot and could see Sarah and some guy crawling into the passenger side of his Jeep. I thought that was a little odd, so I kept watching. After a few seconds it was pretty clear they were fooling around. He was in the seat and she was straddled on top of him. I saw him grab the back of her shirt and slide it off. Sadly her back was to me, so I couldn't see the good side. A little bit after that I see her shifting around and then his hand grabs the back of her pants and starts pulling them down. She had a killer ass and it was now only a few inches from the windshield in clear view. As she spread her legs to straddle him again, I could then see everything. I looked around to make sure no one else was around. My lights were off so no one could really see me. She started riding him slowly at first. She turned and leaned over to kiss his neck and I could now see one of her breasts jiggling. She had a killer body and I was extremely turned on. She then started riding him faster. I could see her little ass bouncing up and down. I couldn't take it anymore and reached down to relieve myself. A few minutes later they finished shortly after I did. I sat down low in my chair as they walked back to the apartment. I closed my eyes in case they saw me, but thankfully they weren't paying attention. From that point on, I made sure to give Sarah a big smile every time I saw her. What did a family member say or do that you don't talk to them anymore? My stepdad viciously abused one of my sisters in particular, but was also very abusive to the other 4 of us. He screamed right up in our faces if we were too loud, laughing and playing, or anything else he could possibly be upset by. And it was the most random things he'd get upset about, so we didn't ever know when it would happen. He only physically hurt the rest of us a handful of times, but that sister got it really bad. He favorited her and would take her on these lavish vacations, amusement parks, camping trips, all just the 2 of them. We thought it was so unfair that she got all the good stuff and we were screamed at for things as simple as eating something that had sugar in it by my mom too. Well, one day when my sister was in her junior year of high school, she decided to go to a friend with the truth, and that friend forced her to tell the school counselor. I was at the same school in my freshman year. I got called to the office and there were so many police officers and they took me into a room by myself and asked if my stepdad had ever touched me or done anything sexual to me. I said no, he'd never do that, he never did that stuff to me. Then an hour later was finally told what happened when our actual dad picked us up from school early. Come to find out, he was brutally molesting my sister in about every way possible. He was arrested just a few minutes after my sister told the school, while he was at work in front of all his friends. That made me happy that at least he was exposed to all his friends. After that day he was arrested, we weren't allowed to go back to his/my mom's house anymore and we couldn't even get our stuff. I have no idea what she did with it because soon my stepdad was moved to a prison over 7 hours away, and she decided my sister and all of us were lying, that her poor husband was being targeted and was in the lowest of low positions in prison being a child molester. She moved to where he was being kept so she could be with him. A few days after my 14th birthday, she told us she was moving and we might not see her for a while. She moved and left all of us behind so she could continue to be with this sad excuse of a human because he was the victim. She never made contact again. I haven't talked to her in almost 10 years. She was super abusive to us too, as a person with narcissistic personality disorder. She also would not allow us to eat some days because she didn't want us to get fat. She talked down to us, telling us that was our stepdad's house, not ours. We were told that so often that we never felt like it was a home. Oh. And my mom, through her manipulative ways, won custody of us until all this happened. She let us see our dad on the weekends and that was it. She poisoned our minds against our dad, always telling us how awful he was. While my dad never spoke a bad word of my mom. When she left us with him, things got so much better, but we were still abandoned by our mother. 4 out of 5 of us were girls and we didn't have a mother for all the huge milestones as young adults. She doesn't even know my oldest sister has a kid. So yeah, my mom abandoned us and she never tried to contact us. So we gave up any hope of contact/support from her. And it's one of the best decisions I've made. Family isn't only defined by people with the same blood. She isn't my mother. I don't have a mother. And it used to hurt so much, but now I've just accepted it. I just don't have a mother. What was the most inappropriate thing you've seen or heard in a doctor's office? I was having an outpatient surgery and had gone in for my final prep appointment at the hospital the day before. My best friend from work went with me as she was providing my ride home and was caring for me the week after. We worked in medical records. The meeting with the surgical nurse supervisor was in a tiny room off of the surgery check-in center. There was another nurse doing paperwork, but no other patients. The nurse didn't impress me to start. I'd never had a surgery before and was concerned. I have a propensity to infection in my legs, and so she told me about the surgical stockings they would put on me in the OR. I said something about the size of the calves of my legs. Despite 100 pounds weight loss at that point, my calves hadn't changed. I wanted them to be prepared if I really needed them. She scoffed at me like I was an imbecile wasting her precious time. They were prepared for any problem. Insert huff. Here. That embarrassed me a little, but okay. I'll live, right? But then the nurse outside the office had a question for Nurse Snotty about a surgery the next day. They talked about the patient by name over us, like we weren't there. My friend and I just looked at each other wide-eyed, each screaming internally HIPAA violation. We ignored the rest and got through the meeting. The next day, while I was in my little private room waiting for the various consults that were to happen before my surgery, wishing they'd just take me away and get it done, I was pacing around when I noticed the computer screen facing me. I thought it must be about me, so I went to take a look. The information on the screen, not hidden or protected in any way, was a list of patients and the surgeries they were having that day. Full names, DOBs and procedure. Even with anxiety meds in, I managed to be horrified. That information could cost somebody a job or a relationship or their identity if I or one of my personal visitors was so inclined. On a follow-up visit on my surgery, I stopped in the risk management office and made a report. I take patient confidentiality very seriously. I work with patient data daily. I told them I hadn't been adversely affected by what I saw and heard, but was concerned with the way they handled information, which made me wonder who knew what about me. My neighbor had just recently transferred to the RM office from ER duty because of a shoulder injury. I mentioned in conversation some time later in over-the-fence conversation what had happened. I know there was integrity in that office. My neighbor said she received the file with my report, saw my name and immediately closed it and had it reassigned. She said the issues I told her about that day had been topics dealt with by her office. She just hadn't known my report was the impetus for the changes made. I have been in the same hospital several times since and processes are definitely better. What's something your husband did to you that you will never forget? He ended our marriage. Now that he is deceased, I can finally tell how it ended. He came home one night, after having spent the entire evening at the bar, drinking, and slumped down in his chair in the den. I asked him, honey, do you ever regret marrying me? He answered, well, we all make mistakes. Right then I knew we were in some hot water. Maybe I could remedy it or save something from the situation. I said, well, we could always get a divorce. He looked up bleakly and said, no, too expensive. We live in a community property state. I'd have to give you half of everything. I argued I wouldn't ask for half. I want nothing, and maybe I could just leave. He shrugged, no, too messy. How about a separation? I asked, no, it wouldn't really work. I tried to think, look. We don't really love each other, I said, and so if we just walked away from it, what do you think would be an answer? He shook his head. You could always disappear, he said. Disappear? A cold wave went through me. Honey, I have friends. They would ask questions. They would not just accept my vanishing. There would be investigations. My husband looked at me steadily. You don't see well, he said levelly. Accidents happen. A cold fish grabbed my entrails. I knew he and his father were firearms owners. They both worked for city law enforcement. And I knew that they, together, had done away with a local notorious drug dealer previously, as a team. They had killed, and because they were both law enforcement, they could get away with it. My husband had calmly been planning my death. The next morning, I asked my husband, do you remember what we talked about last night? No, he said, having of course forgotten about it due to his alcoholism. We talked about replacing the back screen door, and decided not to. I lied glibly, for once grateful that he had not remembered a thing of the previous night. Needless to say, within the week, I was out of that house and gone. When he finally did ask for a divorce, a year to two later, he asked me why I had left. Well, because I realized that we were just not compatible, and I didn't want to trap you in a lifelong relationship that was not good for you or me. He never once found out the real reason I left, and now that he and his father are both gone, I can tell it. What is the most tragic announcement that was made at your high school? All I can tell you is, he was alive when the ambulance pulled out. This is a tragic story with a happy ending, and one of the most amazing things that ever happened during my teaching career. During my staff period one day, I heard a loud thump from the classroom right above me. Didn't think much about it. One of Kim's kids had dropped something, I guessed. About 15 minutes later, I found out that the thump had been a student, one with a heart condition, who had passed out and fell from his desk. The teacher, one bright cookie, went immediately to the classroom next door, where a former medical technician turned teacher was. He immediately began CPR, and continued to talk to the child. Stay with us. Breathe, son. Breathe. For the next hour, he and the school nurse rotated places, doing CPR, talking to the boy, never giving up. Often, there was no pulse. The ambulance arrived, the student was taken out, with the medic still performing CPR. Our principal called us into the cafeteria after school was finally dismissed. We went into lockdown and dismissed about 30 minutes late, after he was safely transferred to the ambulance, and uttered the statement that began this post. We all left in varying states of depression. Tomorrow we'd hear that he was gone. We were all sure of it. However, the 14-year-old survived the night. And the next. And the next. He was alive. Probably brain damaged, but alive. As the weeks went on, we became fairly used to miracles. He was responding to his mom's words. He was squeezing her hand when she spoke. He had opened his eyes. Okay, he was blind, but still, he opened his eyes. As his dad spoke with him, joking about how he was stuck here with the family, he smiled. He smiled. That boy had the biggest, most beautiful smile I've ever seen, by the way. And then his vision came back. And then his speech. And then his physical abilities. It was one miracle after another, the entire school year. All I can tell you is, he was alive when the ambulance pulled out. And he still is, 12 years later. On the same date every year my ex and I meet up to go camping, and every time it ends up with the best sex of my life. The date is coming up. Very long. Some years ago I decided to go alone on a beautiful 2-day hike a few hours away from where I lived. I decided to do it because I wanted to challenge myself, as I hadn't really done much on my own at that age and highly dependent on other people. If you're familiar with the route and in good shape you can complete it in one day, but due to me getting lost and stopping to enjoy the scenery I had to set up camp twice. A couple of years later I met a girl that I fell in love with instantly. I hadn't been with anyone before, so to me she was extra special, and within 6 months of meeting each other we moved in together. After being together for a little over a year and a half I took her to the same trail that I hiked alone years earlier, and we had an amazing time. We didn't rush it, but because I knew the route we finished late on the second day. The year after and on the same date we walked the trail again. Due to some bad weather we had to set up camp twice. Even though that year wasn't as good as the first, we enjoyed it a lot. Third year of being together things wasn't as good as the previous years. I could feel something was wrong in our relationship, but it being my first relationship I didn't know it had run its course. In an attempt to bring back the spark I suggested we should do the trip a third time and she agreed. We had a good time, but it just wasn't the same. A little bit after this I ended the relationship because I could tell she wasn't happy. Or I thought she wasn't happy. The next few months absolutely sucked for me. I decided to go no contact because talking to her would be too hard. I still loved her very much. I struggled a lot for about 8 months. I quit my job, I moved back in with my parents, and I isolated myself completely. I quit doing anything that reminded myself of her. We used to watch TV shows together, play games on my Nintendo, we cooked together and had our favorite recipes. I stopped doing all of this. I couldn't even go back to dating. Even flirting with girls felt wrong. I was absolutely miserable, so in an attempt to get my shit back together, I thought it'd be a good idea to reintroduce myself to the things we did and make them my own. I cooked our favorite meal, I watched the last season of Game of Thrones, and I invited a friend over to play Mario Kart. It was depressing at first, but after a bit I managed to enjoy doing it without her. Thinking I was getting over her, I figured I should go on our hike once again alone, just like I did the first time. It was the ultimate symbolic nail in the coffin of our relationship. My plan was to start dating again after this trip, and I knew exactly who I was going to ask out. The day came for the trip, and I was getting ready. I was excited, but a little bit depressed as well. I felt butterflies in my stomach and a little bit nauseous. I was shaking more and more the closer I got to the parking site. I arrived late in the day as my sleep schedule had been rather out of sync for a very long time. Once I got my gear out of the car, I debated not doing the trip at all. It didn't feel right somehow. After thinking about it for some time, I decided to do it. I had to do it. I didn't enjoy it at first, but it was a beautiful day, so I came to enjoy it after the first hour or so. I was getting hungry, so I looked for a spot to camp for the night. After eating and thinking for a little bit, I decided to walk a little longer. I remembered the first camping spot my ex and I used, and it was only a 25-minute walk or so. Once I got there, I spotted another tent in the exact same spot as we were in the first time. I tried to look around for a person, but there I couldn't see or hear anyone. I set up my tent not too far away, but not too close either, so they wouldn't feel creeped out. I sat outside with a fire enjoying the dusk. It was getting dark when I heard the neighbor talking on the phone. It was a girl and her voice was so recognizable I freezed up for about a minute. I tried to listen to what she said, but I couldn't make it out. I was 90% sure it was her, but it had been a long time. She didn't talk after that, so I guess she fell asleep. I, on the other hand, could not sleep at all. I was still using the same tent my ex and I used when we went together. I hoped she would recognize it in the morning, but to make sure, I left my sweater outside that I'd had for years. When I woke up the next morning, I had hardly slept at all. My entire body screamed for me to look outside and see if the neighbor tent was still there. When I finally did, I saw that it wasn't. I got out, ready to eat my breakfast, and then I saw her. It was really her. She waved at me, and after a few seconds I waved back. She came over towards me and said hello. I asked her why she was there, and she told me she enjoyed the hike so much she wanted to do it again. I asked her if she was with anyone, and she said no, it was just her. I remember thinking it was a little odd, as she'd always been a little scared at night when we were together. I couldn't imagine her ever going alone. I was also very shocked to even see her again. I can barely remember what happened just after that, but I remember eating my breakfast and sharing some of my cookies with her. She showed me her new tattoo and told me she was planning to get more. I never took her for a tattoo person. She had changed so much, but she still had the same personality. For the rest of the way we walked together, we talked and we laughed. Eventually we made it to the second camping spot and we set up our tents. We got ready to eat and compared our foods. I brought MRE spaghetti and she had stale crisp bread, not exactly sure what it's called in English, and liver pate. She looked a little disappointed, so I asked her if we could switch because my stomach hurt a little bit and I didn't feel like eating spaghetti. She didn't accept at first, but after some convincing she happily accepted my offer. It was getting late, so we decided to head to bed. I was crazy tired after walking all day, so I fell asleep almost immediately. Sometimes during the night I woke up and heard her coming into my tent. She told me she was hearing some scary sounds. I told her I couldn't hear anything. She mumbled something for a bit and then asked me if she could sleep in my tent with me. I was half asleep but somehow managed to move my stuff around enough to make room for her. She brought her sleeping bag and got inside. I was just about to fall asleep when I heard her taking her clothes off, and suddenly I was wide awake. She never enjoyed sleeping with her clothes on, so I knew she was naked. She also made sure to leave her bra between our sleeping bags so I could get a good look on it. It took some discipline to fall back asleep, but eventually I managed to do it. When I woke up the following morning, she was still sleeping and I was spooning her. I had set up my tent with a little bit of an incline, so sometimes during the night she must have inched closer and closer to me. After so many months of not being with someone, lying this close her and knowing she was naked in her sleeping bag made me extremely horny. I almost came right there in the sleeping bag. I decided to go out and rub one out in the woods, but the action of getting out of my sleeping bag woke her up. I told her I was going out to pee, but I don't think I hid my boner well enough. I got out and realized I really had to pee, so I stood by the trees for a few minutes waiting for it to calm down enough to let the water out. It was close to impossible, but eventually I managed to do it. Having been out there for a good few minutes, I heard her yelling at me asking what was taking so long. I just said I really had to pee. She told me to come back, but I knew I wouldn't be able to walk all day this horny. She yelled again, so I went back inside. She was still in her sleeping bag, still mostly naked, but she had put on a thin, but still see-through sweater. She sat up straight and zipped down her sleeping bag and gave me a good long look at her boobs. I swear I almost passed out from blood loss. I couldn't hold myself back, so I kissed her. She kissed me back, and within seconds we were both naked on her sleeping bag having sex. We had sex twice, and to this day it's some of the best sex of my life. For the rest of the trip we were back to our old selves, exactly how we were before the relationship took a bad turn. It felt amazing, and I don't think I've ever been happier. When the trip ended, we hung around for a bit, but eventually got back in our cars and drove off. When I got home, I unblocked her on Facebook and looked through her profile. Sadly, I noticed a guy she had introduced me to at the end of our relationship in some of her pictures. I asked my friend, and he said they got together a few weeks after we ended it. I'm not sure if she cheated on me or if she just acted weird because she developed feelings for the guy, but I fell back into the same depression I developed after our breakup. It didn't last as long, but it took much more for me to get out of it. I also learned from our mutual friend that he was the reason she got into tattoos, and that they only dated a few months and that she was the one that ended it. I wanted to contact her, but after some time and rational consideration I decided not to. After some time I met a new girl. She was amazing and I enjoyed her company a lot. I realized that I didn't love her, but I clinged on to her to not be alone, I think. We dated for a few months, but I couldn't get serious with her. I believe she was in love with me, so I couldn't bring myself to end it. My yearly hiking trip date was coming up. I debated going, but I knew I wouldn't be able to keep myself from going just in case my ex did. I packed my stuff and left for the hike. I got there early and waited in my car to see if she showed up. I sat in my car for 2 hours just waiting when I finally saw a car arriving. Sure enough, it was her, but the car was new. I waved at her and she smiled and waved back. We caught up and I told her I had a girlfriend. She looked a little disappointed, but she was happy for me. She did ask if I minded us sharing a tent so she didn't have to carry hers, and stupidly enough I agreed. We started the hike and we had a good time. It was not the same as the previous year. It got a little awkward at times, but it was fun. The first night was tough. She once again got naked in her sleeping bag and I was horny as hell. My girlfriend and I did not have good sex. It was boring and I prioritized masturbating over having sex with her most of the times. That night I got out to masturbate 2 times and I was still horny when trying to fall asleep. The next morning she woke me up saying she was ready to eat. When I finally managed to open my eyes and look at her, she unzipped her sleeping bag showing me her fully naked body. We kissed and touched each other for a little bit, but I broke it off before anything really happened. I had no idea where that strength came from, but I didn't want to cheat on my current girlfriend. We ate breakfast and after a quick bathroom break away from each other, I masturbated, set off for the last part of the trail. Things got weird and we decided to walk the rest of the way over camping another night. We got to the end and said our goodbyes and immediately I regretted finishing the hike so early. I stopped her from leaving and invited her to talk for a bit. We sat on a bench and talked. I told her I wasn't happy with my girlfriend and she helped me a good bit. I realized I had to break up with her. By the end we kissed and touched each other some more. I fingered her for some time and she blew me. She ended it there and we went our separate ways. First thing I did after coming home was to break up with my girlfriend. She cried for a bit, but took it surprisingly well. I talked a little bit with my ex after that, but nothing really came out of it. I was so into her, almost obsessed. After some time I blocked her again. She didn't really return my messages, so I left it at that. Eventually I had mostly forgotten about her. I had some random hookups but nothing that really lasted. The date was getting closer and I started thinking about her again. If I went, would she be there? I was happy and sad. I wasn't in love with her anymore, or not like I used to at least. My feelings for her was confusing. The date was coming up and I made sure to take the Friday off from work in good time, but the day before they called me and said I had to come in. I decided not to go on the hike, even though I was all packed and ready. When the morning came I got up and ready for work. In the shower I suddenly felt really sad and depressed. I called work and told them I couldn't come in. They said it was fine and that the guy who called off was coming anyway. I hurried up and packed my camping gear into my car and drove towards the hiking trail faster than I've driven before in my life. I was super excited to get there, and scared she wouldn't be there at the same time. I had no idea if she'd be there or not. I hadn't asked around what she was up to or looked at her Facebook at all. That made it even more exciting and scary. Only stop I made along the way was to buy the most optimistic condoms and lube I've ever bought. Eventually after some delays I made it to the trail parking spot. I drove around looking with my pulse going crazy. It was taking forever even though the parking spot is really small. I spotted a familiar car and sure enough, there she was. She was glowing and smiling wider than I've ever seen her before. She looked so happy. I got out and gave her a hug. It felt so good to just stand there and hug her. We hugged for probably 5 minutes, but it felt like it's only been 10 seconds. I could not get enough of her. We set off once again, with only one tent. I had brought a comfy inflatable mattress, pillows and blankets this time so she didn't even bring her sleeping bag. We didn't get far, not even the usual camping spot before we were all over each other. The spot. Have you ever had a really bad feeling about a place, and immediately abandoned what you were doing, and got the hell out of there? I was dating a guy who had been in the Navy. We were in Amsterdam. I was curious about the red light district. I wanted to see it for myself. It was winter and about 11 p.m. As soon as we got to the cobblestone area I began to feel uneasy. I don't know why. I didn't want to tell my boyfriend because he's older and had been in the Navy. I should feel safe with him. We strolled around looking at the girls. I actually felt sad for them. Not all were pretty and they didn't look happy. It felt a little depressing actually and I felt bad for gawking. The deeper we got the deeper I felt unsettled. Something weird was in the air. I've been everywhere and lived in some of the toughest cities in America. It's rare for me to feel uneasy. I looked at my boyfriend and I was like, please don't think I'm weird, but I keep feeling like we are in danger. I feel weird, like something weird is gonna happen. He took one look at me, said nothing and grabbed my hand. He got us out of there and it felt like a maze of cobblestone streets and red lights. Finally we were in the main square again, well lit with people. I could breathe. I asked him why he was so hasty. I had expected him to put up an argument or call me jealous or something. What he said to me sticks with me to this day. He said in the service sometimes you would get an eerie feeling like something was going to happen before it did. He said if you feel that way, get the hell out. No questions asked. No time for talk. Get the hell out of there. I never really have had that feeling since, but the minute I told him how I felt he went from casually strolling to the very brisk fast walk the hell out of there. To not flunk out of college, I changed my grades and thousands of others as well. When I was a student at a major university in the late 80s, I was failing several classes miserably. I had completely screwed up in 2 of my 6 classes and I needed to make a plan of how not to flunk out. For one class, I decided to dedicate all my spare time in correcting where I went wrong and fix it by acing the final exam. The other class, which was much more technical, required that I come up with a plan. Keep in mind, that I was a total goody two-shoes kid who felt like they were in a desperate situation. Failing out of college was not something I could allow to happen. Desperate times, desperate measures. The class that I needed to pass was a science/engineering class that I had not bothered to go to. So I went to the very last Thursday class to figure out my plan. One thing the professor did say was that if you had a 93 or higher average in the class you could opt out of the final exam that was happening in 1 week. I had a 64 average, so I had to take the exam. How was I going to ace this exam? My grades were too low to get pulled up enough. The only way to fix this was to get my grades changed. So I came up with a Hail Mary plan. One that involved a few rules to be broken, and by rules, I mean laws. The science building where the class was given would close for the weekend. This meant that the professor's offices were locked and most of the labs were locked as well. You could still get into the main parts of the building, but you had to talk to a security person if it was after hours. There wasn't digital badges and shit like that back then, so here was my plan. On Friday afternoon after most classes were over, I scoped out the whole building. It was a U-shaped building that was 3 stories tall. I had to find a way in. Luckily, I found one of the first floor labs on the inside of the U had large horizontal windows that could be unlocked and would allow for someone to crawl through. Even better, one of the lab's windows were obscured by a small fenced-in area that housed some of the electrical and HVAC units. Large bushes lined the fence as well. So while I was there I went into the lab and unlocked a window to allow myself a place to enter the building. The door of the lab was propped open and I unpropped it and let it close. It locked. Good to know. It also reduced the chances of someone relocking the window. I also scoped out the professor's office. It was open but he was not there. It was very small with no windows. Just enough room for a desk, his chair and a couple of other chairs. His office door was an all-metal door painted beige except for a small center window in the middle. The window had a wire screen built into the glass held in place by a simple screwed-on frame. There were lots of manila envelopes and schedules etc. on the door as well. This would be a challenge but I had formed my plan. At around 3:30 in the morning I arrived back at the building with my backpack and a plan to break into TH building. I had a hammer, pliers, a roll of tape and some screwdrivers that I had scrounged and I was nervous as hell. I made way through the bushes and climbed over the fence. I checked the window and it was still unlocked. I pulled myself up through the window and into the dark lab. Remembering that the lab doors would lock behind you, I slowly opened the lab door and placed some tape on the lock to stop it from locking. I was expecting a quiet building but instead was greeted by the loud sound of machinery running. Another lab was conducting an all-night test or something and at least 3 upper-level students were there overseeing the project. In a way that was good because my presence wouldn't necessarily be noticeable by others. I would find out later that it would also cover any noises I made. I made my way to the professor's office door which was in a more out-of-the-way part of the building. The office was located right by one of the stairwells so I could hear anyone coming down the stairs and also, if someone happened to start coming from the other way I could use the stairs for a quick exit. I pulled out the screwdriver to start unscrewing the frame around the glass window in his door and soon realized that the screws were covered in decades of paint. Not good. What I thought was going to be a 2-minute job turned into a 45-minute job. I went into what I would call flock it mode and just went to town on this window frame. I had a few starts and stops but no one came by. I got the frame off and tried to pry the glass out of the frame. It was sealed in with paint. Getting the glass out took a monumental amount of slow prying and steady effort. After 30 minutes of scraping and gentle pressure I had the glass pane out. I slowly reached in and turned the lock to unlock the door. I grabbed a large manila folder on the outside of door and repositioned it over the window, a perfect cover for the now mauled up window. I slid into the office and looked for something to cover the window that would block light. The desk calendar worked well and a few pieces of tape held it up well. Then I turned the lights on to survey the scene. I was now presented with a desk, a chair and small slim table behind the desk. Of all the ways my plan could go wrong, my biggest fear was that the professor may have taken all of his grades home with him. A quick look into the large flat file on his desk and I had his full handwritten grade register in my hands and the pen he used for recording grades was tucked right inside. He taught 6 classes that semester and I only needed to change 1 grade, my grade. However, now that I had seen how banged up the paint was on the glass window frame, I knew I had to alter the plan. I searched through the gradebook and found all of my grades and saw I had several in the 70s and some lower 60s grades. I had done some work in the class. I thought it over for a few seconds and started executing plan B. I went through every single class he had and began randomly changing anything in the 60s to read as in the 80s. Then I went through and changed all the 70s I found to read as 90s. I realized that the changed grades wouldn't stand up under close scrutiny, so I had to create a herd immunity of changed grades. I noticed a few bad students in some of his classes and made some extra efforts at changing their grades. A 0? Now an 88. This was taking a while. With 6 classes and 50 students or so in each class, and about 10 grades per student, there was about 3,000 grades in this register. I changed at least 1,500 of those grades. Of course my grades were changed as well. Lots of numbers in the 90s. I closed the grade book and placed it back in the drawer exactly as I had found it, but I hear a little plink sound. I pulled on the drawer and realized it was now locked but wasn't before. Okay, so maybe he'll think he locked it. No big deal. My mind began to wonder of what the aftermath of this might be. Would this work? Would I be able to get away with not taking the exam by creating this academic chaos? About this time was when I noticed the IBM PC on his back table. Did he record his grades on a handwritten register in his PC? If he had a backup of the grades, all of this would be for nothing. Also, I couldn't reference all the changed grades. The drawer was now locked. I booted up his IBM PC XT and saw that it had 2 3.5 disk drives. There's 5 disks by the computer. What to do? I load each disk in the drive and typed L. And nuke them all. I hadn't planned on this but then flock it mode. So let's review the plan. Changed so many grades that he would have to take an impossible amount of time to deconstruct the chaos and simply give out good grades or at least better grades as needed. No one particular student would be identifiable as a culprit because there were plenty who had a motivation to change the grades. This was as good of an idea as I could come up with. After having distributed all the good grades to all the good boys and girls, I gathered my tools and planned my exit strategy. The back of his door had a few items taped to it as well, so I replaced the glass and frame and covered it with another manila folder. I wrote a poorly written note on a post-it that said, "Sorry, mop handle cracked the glass. Replace glass. Maintenance." I then split, got past the grad student running the machine, slipped out the window and never went back. Didn't show up for the final exam either because higher than A, edited, 90-93 average and all. Waited 45 long days that summer to get my grades. Got a 90 in the class. Yeah. Okay, no complaints. There had to be some other people who got their grades and were happier as well. Never suffered any consequences on this either, but it was the most stressful night of my life. I haven't done shit like this ever again. What happened to your school bully? In high school, I had two bullies. Mark was tall and lanky and always tripped me and kicked my book bag into the street. His bullying was more prankish than malicious, but it still bugged me. Tom was shorter, stocky, and brutal. I took a number of ass kickings, sent home bloodied, scuffed up, ripped clothes. I came home to my brothers and mom, who would cut me down. My mom would cuss me out and threatened, "If you run from a fight, you'll have a worse one when you get home," a threat my siblings carried out without her okaying it. Tired of the beatings in school and the embarrassment and beating at home, I finally got the nerve to retaliate against Mark and Tom. I caught Mark off guard and pushed him really hard into a brick wall. I scratched up his face while punching him in the head several times, until he broke free and ran. Tom was a harder nut to crack. The first time I retaliated, he came up behind me and punched me between the shoulder blades, knocking the wind out of me. I turned to smash him with my trumpet case and he KO'd me with one punch. I came to in the nurse's office. The assistant principal was with the nurse and my mom. They were talking about the incident, and the nurse told them I had been in her office several times for bruises, twists, strains, but I never told who did them, and they were trying to blame mom, who was no angel, mind you, but that's forever ago, and, well, she's mom. I was still groggy when I got up from the bed in the nurse's office. I clumsily pushed past mom, the nurse, and Mr. A, went to my locker, and grabbed my skateboard. And then I sat, patiently, on the mini wall in front of the school, where every day, I would take a beating or some other humiliation from Tom. He showed up, his menacing face making me afraid. I was terrified, but now wasn't the time to back down. My mom, my teachers, other students, I wasn't going to get punked out this time. I stood up, still unsteady from the punch in the face I took earlier. I licked my lip, tasting the dried blood's metallic saltiness, and I felt the swelling on my cheek from the punch, and I got angry. It was a blur, but I do remember Tom diving at me, and I clobbered him in the face with my board, putting him on his back, and me, significantly smaller but enraged, pounding and kicking him mercilessly. Slamming my board into the side and top of his head. I lost it, I snapped, and I actually kind of liked it. I attacked my bully, and the rage against him and my family fueled my fighting back. I spent the night in juvenile lockup, but the school dropped the proposed expulsion charges against me, as it was proven I was bullied by this guy. There were no assault charges, because he assaulted me first. After that, though, the small, evil kid with the yellow skateboard was left alone, and his brothers thought twice or more before messing with me. What's the biggest mistake you made in college? When I was looking for a roommate in college, I was genuinely desperate. You see, I was moving out of state to a large school with no one that I knew. I scoured every incoming freshman Facebook page and even unsuccessfully reached out to a few people. Eventually, the day before we had to pick our roommates, if we didn't want to be assigned a rando, I finally got a message back. "Hey, what's up?" he said. His name was Eric and he seemed cool enough. I messaged him back and we had a relatively long conversation about our living styles, both of us saying all of the cliché things that people do. But, by the end of it, I had a roommate locked and loaded. I was happy, until move-in day. I got to the dorm at around 1 p.m. to music already blasting out of the door. When I stepped inside, I found Eric fully unpacked and essentially trashing the room. Now, this wasn't necessarily bad, but it was a red flag, that's for sure. He turned down the music when I stepped inside and we chatted while I unloaded my things. Then, he mentioned a party. He was from a few towns over, so he already knew a ton of people, which was great for me. So, that night we went to his friend's dorm and I watched him drink shot after shot after shot until he was so hammered that he could barely walk and he lost his grandfather's watch somewhere on the vast campus. I was already annoyed with him, but then things just kept getting worse. One day, when I was asleep in my twin XL bed, I felt a presence looming over me. I slowly opened my eyes and Eric was standing next to my bed with his head right over mine, staring at me. I didn't know what to do, so I turned away. Then it happened again a few nights later. And again and again and again. I'm a pretty non-confrontational person, but it was starting to be too much. What pushed me over the edge though was when I entered my room for the first time after winter break. I had just had a month away from him and life was great. When I pushed that door open, I saw the strangest thing ever. He had duplicated my side of the room. Everything down to where the tape was placed on the posters was the same. My jaw dropped and my heart began to pound. Then, the door flung open and Eric was standing there in the exact same outfit I was wearing. He must have seen my Snapchat and went out to buy the same clothes. Even his hair was different. He barely said a word to me as he walked in. He just smiled and sat down at his desk. What are you 100% sure of you saw, but nobody believes you? In 2003, when I was 14, I started bussing tables for a local pizza place to save money for my first car. My grandpa decided he was going to sell his '76 Camaro and I knew I had to have it. I mean, he used to pick me up from daycare in this thing. It had to stay in the family. Anyway, I get enough money to buy the car from my grandpa, and my dad spends the money to ship it down from out of state. Thanks again, Dad. I love this thing more than life itself. It smells the way I remember. It struggles to start without giving it a little gas, but once you get her running, she rolls like a top. When I was around 17, I was driving home from my late shift at the pizza place and the headlights and console lights are more dim than normal. I thought it was odd, so I fidgeted with console light controls and the high beam button on the floor, but nothing worked, so I figured I would talk to my dad about it in the morning. Early the next morning the home phone rings. It is my grandma crying, telling us that grandpa is sick and the doctors don't know if he will make it. We all head out and drive 17 hours straight to be with him. He starts getting a little better while we were there and comes through the worst of it, and doctors think he will have a few weeks. We decided to get back home for a bit and come back in a week or so. The second night back in town I went to pick up my then girlfriend, but when the night started getting dark I flipped on the headlights and everything was back to normal brightness. I can't explain it, but I just felt at ease. I felt assurance that my grandpa was going to be okay. Anyway, weeks go by, then months, then years. 6 wonderful long years go by. Grandpa has been slowly declining lately and we had plans to come back up again. By this time, the Camaro was no longer my daily driver, but I wanted to take my fiancée for a ride in it, so we went to my parents' house to take it out. I noticed the dome light didn't come on. We get a call later that day that my grandma passed away very unexpectedly, so we make the journey back up there immediately, completely heartbroken. When we get there, my grandpa isn't very responsive. He is being kept alive by machines and there isn't much brain activity. Extremely difficult to see your hero in such a state. My dad and I break the news to him that grandma passed away. Instantly his face changes, his eyes swell up and a few tears gently fall down his face. He passed away that night. Haunted trail / house workers of Reddit. What's the craziest thing you've seen / heard on the job? Our house had a front walkway that was bordered by the wall of the house on the left, and a rickety wooden fence with a gate on the right. The carport was on the other side of the wooden fence. The front door faced the carport and was directly across from the gate. Basically, you had to walk through a narrow hallway to get to the front door on the left, or through the gate to the carport on the right. My brothers hauled a record player onto the roof and had an album of spooky sounds that they put on. This was in 1975 or so and we were poor, so we didn't even have speakers. Just the loud, tinny sound of a portable turntable. We made a human figure of stuffed clothing and hung it by the neck from the rafters of the walkway. Brother Bob rigged little red lights for eyes. Brother David built a coffin and placed it on the side of the house in the walkway. He dressed himself as Dracula and took his place in the coffin. Bob dressed himself as some sort of monster and then draped chains all over his chest and the gate, essentially chaining himself to the fence. I dressed as a witch and waited at the door to pass out candy. The overall effect from the street wasn't too intimidating, just the music and the dead hanging body. The plan was to scare the bejesus out of the kids after they passed the entrance. And scare them we did. Now, remember this is 1975. Parents stood at the sidewalk if there were parents in attendance at all. These brave little kids walked up our sidewalk with both eyes fixed on the dead body. Once they got past that horror, they were now in the walkway when David would sit up in his coffin, scaring them into running toward the front door. Once there they never even saw Bob until he lunged at them, the chains holding him back. I would open the door, cackling like the witch I am, to give them candy. However, the poor traumatized kids would blast into the house screaming and crying. Not a one of them would agree to go back out the front door, or come near me, either, so my mother had to escort them through the kitchen and out into the carport so they could run screaming into their parents' arms. We were a success. Every kid in our neighborhood probably had nightmares about us that night. We never did it again though. It was a one-night show. But, our legend lived on. From 1975 until they sold the house in 1988, my parents never had a single trick or treater again. Mom would stand at the door with her little bags of candy and hear the kids screaming at their parents to run past the house. Nobody came to the door. Nobody, ever, again. Alien abductees or those who claim to have seen a UFO / alien phenomena. What is your story? Let me preface this by stating that almost all of the encounters that I have witnessed have been with at least one other individual. The first 2 encounters happened on 2 consecutive days in 1997, and the numerous other encounters happened over the span of 90 days a year and a half ago. I do not recall being abducted. I have filed reports with the incredibly incompetent MUFON. Back in 97 my buddy and I had just finished up our shift at a pizza joint. It was after 11 p.m. We were wore out and wanted to get stoned. We were completely sober. Anyway, we drove out into a cornfield in the off year, so it was full of rye. We were about a half mile off the road. It was pitch black, and because of our vantage point, I could see headlights in any direction for a good mile. We were way out in the country, so no worries. My buddy starts breaking up the weed when I notice what I believe to be truck headlights shine directly from behind, take a hard left, and disappear. My buddy didn't seem to notice, but I became frantic. I thought it was the cops. My friend thinks I am messing with him and continues breaking up some really terrible brick weed. I recall looking at the stars, and one star in particular grabbed my attention. I can't tell you why, but it looked like your average star. Within 30 seconds this star starts moving up and down, side to side, and in circles. I yelled in a panic, What the flock is that? My buddy gives a dismissive sigh, and then he looks where I am pointing. For 5 minutes the UFO continues to move in very fluid movements, making impossible maneuvers, and do so in complete silence. Without notice, this one object becomes 5 equally impressive star-like objects. They stayed close together. At times they moved in some kind of formation, and other times they seemed to move independently. Just as quick as the 5 came, they fused back together as one. We were in shock, but we didn't feel like we were in harm's way. We were recapping what we witnessed, but that single UFO was still there. It wasn't moving too much. We thought things were coming to a close, but we were wrong. This time the one object turned into at least 7 objects. The way they moved and jerked around felt aggressive to me. My friend must have felt the same way, because he said he was starting to get nervous. I told him we should go. I embarrassingly confessed that I knew it was there for us, and I became fearful. We haul us out of there, and this thing follows us to the outskirt of town. What are some things that look harmless during the day, but get insanely creepy during the night? Good people sometimes pick up hitchhikers in the middle of the night. You see, one time a few years ago I had gone to a concert with my girlfriend and sometime in the middle of the show she disappeared. Eventually she came back with some guy who I had never met but she was obviously very close with. The show ends and my girl asks me if it would be alright if we gave her friend a ride home. Sure, I said that shouldn't be a problem despite the fact she had ditched me for this random guy at the show. Well, we get to the guy's house and she asks if it would be cool if we had a few drinks together. I told her I wanted to go but she convinced me to stay. Eventually the two of them go inside to get something and don't come back out. After 15 or 20 minutes I go inside looking for them and can't find them anywhere. I look for a while before deciding flock it, she is obviously cheating on me with this guy, and so I leave. My phone was dead. It was around 2:30 in the morning. I had no idea where I was, and so naturally I started walking. After about an hour of walking I finally recognized a landmark and realized I had been walking in the opposite direction from my house. Disappointed, sad, quite drunk, newly single, and alone I turn around and start walking the other way. My feet started to hurt after a number of miles. I was starting to cry a bit, and so I decide I would hitchhike when I saw the occasional car. A number of cars pass without stopping, but soon enough a car pulls over for me. Thank God, but who the flock is willing to pick up a hitchhiker at this time, I wondered? It turns out it was 2 high school kids pulling an all-nighter after a party and who thought I looked like I needed help. I told them about how shitty my night was and they told me they would cheer me up. We ended up driving around until 5 or 6 a.m. smoking weed and freestyle rapping to beats that one of them made. They taught me all about how to let rhymes fly and told me I was a natural. We were telling jokes and stories and laughing and having a hella good time. They gave me a ride to my house when the sun started to come up, and in return I gave them a decent bit of weed. I forgot all about the girl until the next day when I woke up and turned my phone back on, but I will never forget those 2 guys who helped me get home safely. Night Watchman of Reddit, what is the creepiest situation you've been in on shift? I used to work for a relatively small security company. It was privately owned, had about 30 employees altogether. They'd get a contract with a factory and then basically your job was to sit in that factory for 8 to 12 hours when no one was working in it. So I'd be working by myself, alone, overnight, in a completely empty factory. In my 2 years of doing that job, I never one time saw a single thing I would call supernatural. However, I did see Dennis. One night my captain calls me on my phone and tells me a new trainee will be coming in about 5 a.m. and to show him the ropes, teach him how to make rounds. You walk around the building, that's basically what making a round is, etc. So it's about 4:45 a.m. and I step outside to the parking lot to have a smoke and wait on the new guy. After about 10 minutes a car pulls up, stops, backs up, and drives away. I was clearly visible, so I have no idea why he left, but the car passed by about 3 to 4 more times before finally pulling in and shutting off the engine. I can see him in the car and he's just sitting in the driver's seat staring at me. In the back seat are 2 kids probably around 6 to 8. After about 3 minutes of me wondering what the flock is going on, he gets out of the car. Dennis is flocked up looking. He's about 4 feet 10 inches and fatter than damn near anyone I have ever seen. He has a huge rash covering about 70% of his body with a white crust outlining most of it. He then speaks. Had a little trouble finding the place. His voice is high-pitched. I mean really high-pitched. I'm talking Judge Doom in the final scene of Who Framed Roger Rabbit high-pitched. Then he extends his hand to shake mine. Without thinking much, I shake it. There's 1 finger on it. 1. And the rest of the hand looks like some kind of stumpy flesh mitten. One of the kids gets out of the car, has the same rash, is also very fat, is also missing fingers. He says, "Daddy, can I get a drink?" Dennis turns around and screams in that high-pitched voice, "Get back in the damn car and don't you get out again." I'm in flocking shock. So I take the guy around the factory, show him the perimeter, tell him where emergency stuff is. About a minute into our walk I notice this guy smells like hell. I mean, he literally reeks of ball sweat and fresh diarrhea. The whole time he's asking me strange questions, like, do you have a crush on anyone that works here? Or can I hunt on this property? He finally leaves after standing in the office trying to make small talk with me for about 15 minutes after the tour. On his way out he said, "We're gonna be good friends, even if you don't think so now." I went home about 2 hours later and stood in the shower for a good solid hour washing myself, trying to get the image of that guy out of my head. Called my captain and asked him to reassign me someplace else. Never had to see him again. That's been more than 10 years and it still bothers me. I found a hidden camera in my room. On June 15th I heard a talking device in my room. It said something somewhat quietly and I couldn't understand it. I jokingly texted my boyfriend that something in my was talking to me, thinking it was just some device I might have left on or something, so then we both just disregarded it and let it be. Everything was fine until Sunday night when I heard something clearly say something like the camera connection is successful. I thought it was strange, so I started looking around and went through literally everything in my room and moved my dresser forward a bit but could not find anything. I then called my boyfriend about it and he told me if I found whatever it was to just throw it away. So I continued my night like normal and played some games, then went to bed. The next morning I wanted to watch some TV on my Roku, but apparently when I moved my dresser looking for the sound I knocked it down, so I had to move my dresser more and look completely behind it. I had a pile of stuffed animals leaning against the dresser, so to avoid them falling over I moved them out of the way, but when I did I found a home camera plugged in behind my dresser and it was on. I quickly unplugged it and called my mom crying. She was at work. She seemed freaked out yet somewhat calm and told me we'd figure it out when she got home. But I had work and was going to my boyfriend's house after. So this camera was in my room for 2 weeks and at this point I was freaked out. Nobody had been to our house in a while and the only people in the house are my 2 brothers, mom, and stepdad, and we have deadlocks on our doors, so there's no possible way of someone breaking in. It has to be one of my very own family members and I don't know how to find out who. My boyfriend and I have the camera, but my parents are telling me to bring it back because they paid for it and that I should just let it go because we won't find out who hid it in my room, and that they are setting it up in our living room because that's where it used to be to see the front door. So my parents are being really chill about this situation and aren't trying anything to find out who it was and only care about the fact that they paid for it and want it back. My boyfriend and I want to take it to the police, but my parents are telling us no and I'm afraid they will kick me out or treat me bad if we do go. I'm staying at my boyfriend's because I'm terrified to go back. Someone in my house has been watching me without clothes and everything, and my guesses are it's my teen brother or stepdad, but no matter who it is I'm pretty sure my mom is covering for them. Doctors and nurses of Reddit, what was the creepiest last words you heard from a patient right before they died? We had a guy in his early 70s who was just a train wreck of health problems. Normally Occam's razor brings cause of death down to one worsening cause. This guy had metastatic melanoma, really bad multiple myeloma, lung cancer that had metastasized, 3 different cancers at the same time. He weighed maybe 80 pounds. Here a code blew over the PA system and the whole team shows up. Chest compressions, epinephrine. We get a pulse back after 3 minutes or so. Guy's chest was destroyed by compressions. There was trouble getting a good line into the veins, so I think they drilled into his shin. Catastrophically painful if you're awake. Dude opens his eyes and looks around a bit, looks scared as hell, can't speak or really moved, but looked terrified. His nurse, standing in the corner for the whole time, pipes up, not sarcastically, he told me he was DNR. The family put the legal stuff in a folder on the chair. We pushed morphine and covered him up, redid his gown. I held his hand until the resident declared him. First death I ever saw. Dead people are cold, just really really cold. No one had ever told me that. Something somewhere went wrong and his computer file hadn't been updated. Only that nurse knew because he and the family had told her. I cannot, to this day, think or understand why she didn't scream at anybody showing up in the room not to touch him or at least look for the folder with his living will in it. She and whoever, doctor, nurse, secretary, whoever that screwed up that charting mistake should be raked over the coals. The family seemed pretty understanding of the mistake, but if they wanted a lawsuit, it would have been a deserved slam dunk. Never gonna forget the way he looked around though. I hope he was disoriented. That would be a horrible reality to have on your mind as you moved on. On a lighter note, bumped into a kid from high school at the gas station, years ago. We chatted for a couple minutes and as he headed out his last words to me were, "We're going to the titty bar." Died as the unrestrained passenger in a car crash that night. He and his buddies were trying to catch air in a car by going over some hump in the road. Crashed into a retaining wall. He was a nice dude. Who was the creepiest college dorm mate you ever had? When I was looking for a roommate in college I felt like I was Saul. You see, I was moving out of state to a large school with no one that I knew. I scoured every incoming freshman Facebook page and even unsuccessfully reached out to a few people. Eventually, the day before we had to pick our roommates, if we didn't want to be assigned a rando, I finally got a message back. "Hey, what's up?" he said. His name was Eric and he seemed cool enough. I messaged him back and we had a relatively long conversation about our living styles, both of us saying all of the cliché things that people do. But, by the end of it, I had a roommate locked and loaded. I was happy, until move-in day. I got to the dorm at around 1 p.m. to music already blasting out of the door. When I stepped inside, I found Eric fully unpacked and essentially trashing the room. Now, this wasn't necessarily bad, but it was a red flag, that's for sure. He turned down the music when I stepped inside and we chatted while I unloaded my things. Then, he mentioned a party. He was from a few towns over, so he already knew a ton of people, which was great for me. So, that night we went to his friend's dorm and I watched him drink shot after shot after shot until he was so hammered that he could barely walk and he lost his grandfather's watch somewhere on the vast campus. I was already annoyed with him, but then things just kept getting worse. One day, when I was asleep in my twin XL bed, I felt a presence looming over me. I slowly opened my eyes and Eric was standing next to my bed with his head right over mine, staring at me. I didn't know what to do, so I turned away. Then it happened again a few nights later. And again and again and again. I'm a pretty non-confrontational person, but it was starting to be too much. What pushed me over the edge though was when I entered my room for the first time after winter break. I had just had a month away from him and life was great. When I pushed that door open I saw the strangest thing ever. He had duplicated my side of the room. Everything down to where the tape was placed on the posters was the same. My jaw dropped and my heart began to pound. Then, the door flung open and Eric was standing there in the exact same outfit I was wearing. He must have seen my Snapchat and went out to buy the same clothes. Even his hair was different. He barely said a word to me as he walked in. He just smiled and sat down at his desk. Snobby rich kid ended up being the coolest person I worked for. I, 30M, have a small moving company. My brother and I started the company and we have 2 employees. So we had a job to move everything from this kid's apartment to his brand new house. I guess he's some kind of finance executive whatever, but he was 22. We all got a cup of coffee and prepared for what we thought would be the worst client we'll ever have to deal with. So we knocked on the door of the apartment and a lady answered with a baby and said, "Oh, you must be the movers. My boyfriend is over at the house. I'll be out of your way." And went into what I thought was a baby room and shut the door. Strangers in the house, I get it, so we stayed away from her. So we loaded up the first truck and went to the address to see a rented pickup and a white Mercedes. I even laughed to my employee and said, "You ready?" Well, he answered the door and had cold Gatorades and snacks for us. He didn't even ask if we needed help. Bro just jumped into the truck and helped us carry shit. So when the second truck came, my brother and other employee had the same surprise to see this kid was actually pretty cool. Next it was like 1 and he said, "Hey, are you guys hungry?" And I said, "Yeah, we'll take a lunch if that's alright with you." And he said, "Oh no, it's on me. What are you guys in the mood for?" We said anything is fine and thanked him, and he ended up ordering from this Thai place. It was good. My brother later was carrying in this chair and he said, "I actually don't think I need that," and he ended up giving it to one of the employees. So after the job we all were like, man, he was actually a super nice guy. Today, about 4 days later, what made me make this post, I grabbed the mail and he wrote us a thank you letter and 4 gift cards, one for all the employees, to a local steakhouse. Lesson to myself: don't judge a book by its cover. What is a sure sign that your life isn't in a good place? It's 2009. You're in your friend's basement, laying on a couch that doubles as your bed. Your alarm is going off, but you don't see the point in getting up. All you can do is stare at the ceiling and wonder how you ended up in this situation. Bills are accumulating at an alarming rate and your savings account is all but depleted. You know you need to make a change. You know you need to get back out there, find a job, and work your way out of this slump you're in. A friend tells you they could put in a good word for you at their office, but you hate the idea of working for some corporate snake that's only out for himself. Mark's landscaping posts a help wanted ad. No experience necessary. It's exactly what you're looking for. It's honest work, no managers breathing down your neck, and you can start immediately. You brush yourself, put on your best smile, and sell yourself as a hard worker. 3 days in and you already hate it. It's too hot, the hours are too long, and Mark is the one reaping the benefits of all your hard work. You finish up for the day, head back to your friend's basement couch, and start coming up with a plan to start a rival landscaping business. The alarm goes off the next morning, but the snooze button is all too easy to hit. You're not worried about making it to work on time. You're about to start your own company that puts Mark out of business. The phone rings. Mark's name flashes on the caller ID, but you send him to voicemail. Instead of going into work, you fall back asleep. The alarm goes off the next morning, but you hit the snooze button. Mark calls, but you send him to voicemail. Instead of going into work, you head out to look at landscaping equipment. Everything is way too expensive and way out of your price range. If only you had the money. You pull out your phone and give Mark a call, but he sends you to voicemail. Mary's pool cleaning posts a help wanted ad. No experience necessary. It's exactly what you're looking for. 3 days in and you already hate it. You go back home to your friend's basement couch and start coming up with a plan to start a rival pool cleaning business. The next morning, Mary's name flashes on the caller ID, but you send her to voicemail. Fast forward to 2019. You're in your friend's basement, laying on a couch that doubles as your bed. Your alarm is going off, but you don't see the point in getting up. All you can do is stare at the ceiling and wonder how you ended up in this situation. Has a doctor ever made a mistake while treating you? Growing up, I, and my siblings, were taken to a very dapper pediatrician. At the time I thought he was quite old, but in retrospect he was probably in his early 50s. This gentleman came from a distinguished family that came here on the Mayflower. Dr. D, as I'll call him, always wore a bow tie with the type of slightly shabby suit coat that old money can get away with. He was a character and much beloved, tooling around the neighborhood on a bicycle. Was he a good doctor? You tell me. I had always been very athletic in grade school and excelled in most sports. But something began happening in middle school when I joined the track team. I could run short sprints very fast but would become winded easily during practice when we had to run laps. I had no stamina and a few times actually vomited from being so out of breath. Same with swimming. My mother took me to see Dr. D, and his conclusion was that I needed to exercise more and build up stamina. So I worked on it, but ultimately it was too frustrating and scary to continue. No more sports. It was only in my mid-20s that I went to the ER with coughing, wheezing, unable to catch my breath after handling a friend's cat. I was given a breathing treatment and could not believe how much better I felt. The ER doctor asked what I took for my asthma. I told him I didn't have asthma. Of course you can see where this was going. An easy diagnosis that, with treatment, would have made a huge difference in my life. The second episode happened when I was about 16. I was trying on a bikini and checking out the rear view with a second mirror. I noticed that my back was really asymmetrical, one side stuck out more than the other, and when I looked more closely I could see one hip was higher than the other, by a lot. I did have very long hair that masked it, but Dr. D had never done the universal screening for scoliosis, which consists of having the adolescent bend at the waist, observed from the rear by the doctor. It would have been instantly clear that I had scoliosis had he done this. It wasn't severe, but a specialist told my mother I probably would have benefited from bracing, but I was too old by that point. It has caused me problems with balance, gait, and pain over the years. Sorry, just realized how long this is. But I wanted to share. My point is that good genes and an Ivy League degree don't make someone a good doctor. When people say never settle, does this mean you should never settle for people who don't give you happiness? I wanted to date men I wasn't attracted to. When asked, I insisted it was because I gave everyone a chance and because looks don't matter and because I might find a gem. The truth is, I didn't deserve the guys I liked. I knew it. I knew it by the semi-faded acne scars on my face and the way my tummy sticks out over my jeans and the jokes I make. How when I say something other people sort of cock their heads and wonder where the hell did I get that from? I'd spend hours on dating apps swiping yes on guys I felt I deserved and no on guys I really wanted. Needless to say, dating didn't go well. I found myself just really hoping they wouldn't ask to kiss me at the end because I didn't want to deal with saying no. I wanted to check my phone while they were talking even though it was rude, even though I wanted to care but I didn't. Even when I enjoyed myself, I looked forward to going home alone. I left every date wondering what a good first date should feel like. Should I feel smitten? Should my heart be racing? Is it okay to just feel content, like I could see them again, except the minute I get in my car I forget what their face looks like because maybe I wasn't really looking? They say that if everyone around you shares the same trait, it's not coincidence, something about you is attracting those people to you. So if every guy I dated made me shove my hands in my pocket so that he couldn't hold them, then it wasn't the men. It was me. I had the rather stunning realization that if I wanted to date men who made my heart skip a beat, then I had to, well, date those men. But God, I was scared. Acknowledging that you find someone attractive is vulnerable. What if they thought I was too stupid, too ugly, too fat, wholly inadequate in every single way? What if they weren't interested in me? What did that say about me as a person, about my worth, my character? Dating guys I didn't like was safe because I knew I could turn them down before they did so to me. Whether I realized it or not. But dating attractive men? Oh no. What if they don't like me? Or worse, what if they do? I wasn't sure I could handle that. Even so, I couldn't handle another date with someone I didn't like. Fuck giving it a chance. If you're not into someone, you're not into them. There's no amount of well-wishing that will change it. So I plugged my nose, closed my eyes, and dove straight into the deep end, without floaties. When I saw cute boys who wrote things I found intriguing, boys with good-looking faces and a physique I liked and ooh, you're into that. That's so cool, I gave them a like. I reached out. I said awkward things. I bumbled. I was, as I described it to a date later, hopelessly myself. And I started getting dates. Some were awful, seriously, don't compare yourself to Ted Bundy on a first date. Some were marginal, and some? Well, some taught me what a good first date is. I don't know about you, but for me, it is butterflies in the stomach and redness in the cheeks and flying in the door at midnight with no one to tell about how wonderful it was that you give the whole play-by-play to your cat, who's just happy to see you're willing to pet him for once. It's staying up late because you don't want the night to end. See, happiness isn't a gift. No one can give it to you and I'd say that no one can take it away. Happiness is what happens when you align what you do with what you want. It's the serendipitous occasion of realizing that yes, this is where I want to be right now. This is what I want. You are what I want. When people say not to settle, they're telling you not to undershoot for fear of getting hurt. Because you will get hurt. Anytime you want something, you'll go through fire to get there. In business you'll lose money, in life you'll lose health, and in love you'll get your heart broken so many times you'll wonder how it still pumps. But the reward of not settling? Is so worth it. Am I the jerk for making my husband a vegan dinner even though he's completely against becoming one? I, 24M, and my husband, 25M, have been happily married for a little over a year now. We met through a mutual friend and he learned very quickly that I am a vegan. About a year after we met and got closer, we started dating. He had no issues with me being vegan, but made it very clear that I couldn't force him into being a vegan, which I respected. I haven't ever put him down for eating meat in front of me, as that is his choice. Each to their own. We even served both vegan and meat-inclusive food at our wedding to accommodate both of our families. Up till now, everything was great. However, recently I've been seeing a ton of vegan recipes on my Pinterest and decided I wanted to try making one for dinner. We don't usually end up getting to have fancy dinners at home as both of us work full-time, but I found some time today to cook something up. It was a recipe for pulled pork sandwiches, but the pork wasn't actually pork, instead it was jackfruit. He seemed a little stressed about work but I showed him the surprise dinner, and that seemed to help his mood out. He ate it happily, and even complimented my cooking. But when he asked what was in it, and when I told him it was a pulled pork sandwich with jackfruit as a meat alternative, he lashed out. He shouted, telling me that he made it clear he was staying a meat eater. I tried explaining that I wasn't trying to turn him into a vegan, but he just walked away then. This happened a few hours back, and now he's refusing to talk to me. I feel like I might be the asshole for making him a vegan meal even though he'd made it extremely clear he wouldn't become one, because even if it wasn't my intention to make him one I still made a vegan dinner that passed off as one with meat in it. So Reddit, am I the asshole?